Gentlemen, RosterWatch Nation, welcome back to the epic RosterWatch podcast, brought to you by RosterWatch.com and by Underdog Fantasy. Go to Underdog Fantasy right now, get a 100% deposit bonus up to $100 by using promo code ROSTER whenever you sign up. The big Best Ball Mania tournament, Best Ball Mania 3 going on right now. $2 million to the winner. $2 million. Our guest today, a great friend of Roster Watch, man. We've known this guy well over a decade since we first met him. Doug, we first met you at the Senior Bowl. Was that 2011? I forget.
I think it might have been 2012. I think it was the Russell Wilson year.
That's it. Russell Wilson, Kirk Cousins,
Yep.
Doug Martin. That year, yeah. That was a good one. He's Doug Kyed. You can find him on Twitter at Doug Kyed. That's Kyed. He's the NFL reporter now at PFF after covering the Patriots for a long time for Nesson. You know him from either of those things. Great friend of Roster Watch. You've heard him on the radio show. You've heard him here on the podcast. He's been out at Patriots OTAs. Doug, what the hell's going on, brother? How's everything up there in the land of the land of all you Bostonites? You guys hanging in okay up there?
Yeah, it's good. No temperatures in the hundreds like you guys have in Texas right now. We've got some pretty good weather, but yeah, I figured, I live in the area anyway. Might as well check out some Patriots OTAs and minicamp over the last couple of weeks. So that was it was fun. It was fun to get back out there, back to my roots a little bit and watch the Patriots.
Well, I wanted to ask you just a couple of national a couple of things about national headlines, but before that, I wanted to ask you just about Patriots since we're on it. And also, I said Bostonites. Is it Bostonites? Is it Bostonians? Like, what do you guys call yourselves?
Yeah, I think it's Bostonians, New Englanders.
New Englanders. New Englanders. All right. Okay. All right. So first, let's talk about Patriots. So there are a million things that we could touch on, and I know you probably had access to some of these players, or at least some of these folks during the OTAs. And I know how reporters can talk to one another and talk to people sort of around there. Did you hear anything about Jacoby Myers? Why he hasn't signed? Isn't there a deal about him not signing his tender just yet? Is there something going on with him? And what do you see? What have you heard about Jacoby Myers? Is there anything going on there?
It is an interesting situation. He was at OTAs and minicamp, was doing individual drills, but was not heavily involved, I think, at all in team drills, which makes sense since he hasn't signed the restricted free agent tender. I'm not sure if that was the reason or if he's just kind of like a little bit banged up or something like that. But it is an interesting situation, and not to get too deep into the weeds here, but his agent is Drew Rosenhaus. And it wasn't originally Drew Rosenhaus. It was originally another firm. And something kind of similar happened this year with another Drew Rosenhaus client, D'Ernest Johnson, who was also a restricted free agent this year. And D'Ernest Johnson had also switched agents to Drew Rosenhaus this offseason. So Drew Rosenhaus with D'Ernest Johnson had him actually sign a separate 1-year contract rather than signing the RFA tender. Not totally sure the reason behind that. But if he hits the incentives, it equals that restricted free agent tender anyway. I'm curious right now is if we see something similar with Jacoby Myers, if that's why he hasn't signed that restricted free agent tender yet, and instead they work out kind of a separate deal, make it a little bit more incentive based, make it have a little bit more guaranteed money than a restricted free agent tender would have. I don't think there's any real concern about Jacoby Myers not being with the Patriots in 2022, but it is definitely notable that he hasn't signed that tender yet, but the fact that he was still out there at practice.
Well, and with that thing for fantasy, or for maybe dynasty or these deeper leagues, that kind of makes me interested in D'Ernest Johnson, because we know that Rosenhaus only swoops in on these guys when he's getting some intel from the league that maybe that they're going to be valued in a certain way that he feels like he can come in and make some money and steal them away from a smaller client. We've seen that happen with literally athlete after athlete. I wonder if he might think that this stuff with Kareem Hunt not getting a long-term deal could play into D'Ernest Johnson maybe getting some more playing time with Cleveland and being able to leverage that in those negotiations to get that new contract. But certainly it's a big deal with Jacoby Myers and something we'll certainly keep an eye on. Whenever he's not out there, just in general, as far as the wide receivers, was there anything you noticed, anything that stood out to you as far as how these guys are looking? I know that, I would imagine that, one of the is Taekwon Thornton out there, but I'd imagine that he would probably be somebody that a lot of folks have their eyes on.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they've got a pretty deep wide receiver core this season, I'd say. It's certainly not in the top end of the league or anything like that, but it goes, 5, 6 deep. So Kendrick Bourne was out there as a starting wide receiver. Yeah, obviously, Jacoby Myers would have been in the mix if he had been out there for team drills. But you've also got Nelson Aguilar, who's taking first team reps out there. Devontae Parker's in the mix now; he's out there taking first team reps. But Taekwon Thornton as well, not taking first team reps, but certainly out there. He's slim, he's slender, but he's
Hmm.
fast and
Yeah.
certainly has the potential in the future. But actually, the most interesting player that got more time with Jacoby Myers off the field or kind of off to the side was Trey Nixon, the Patriots 2021 seventh round pick out of
Hmm.
UCF. He was a four-star recruit, started his college career at Ole Miss, dealt with some injuries, but he was actually thrust in there in the slot, especially on Wednesday. And him and Mac Jones had basically like an incredible connection during the two mini camp practices that we were out there. He's a little bit undersized, like 6 feet, 187, but he made three great catches on deep balls from Mac Jones. Mac Jones was really delivering those touch deep throws really well during practice. And Trey Nixon was beating some good cornerbacks on Wednesday after he'd already made two good deep catches on Tuesday and Wednesday. He was matched up against Jonathan Jones in the slot. Jonathan Jones had really tight coverage on him. The ball was dropping down about 60 yards from Mac Jones. Jonathan Jones actually grabbed one of Trey Nixon's arms, and Nixon was still able to make a one-handed over the shoulder kind of bucket grab with one hand. So, it's non-padded, it's OTAs, it's
Yeah.
minicamp, it's all these things. But when you're already talking about a deep group of wide receivers, now you see Trey Nixon out there in the slot looking like Julian Edelman and Wes Welker. It certainly, adds another name into that mix. Not to go too long on Trey Nixon, but like the guy was really good in minicamp.
Oh, I mean, that's an important thing to file away, and everybody who's listening to this certainly will, because they're crazy degenerates who have played fantasy with big deep rosters. That's exactly the kind of pickup that we're looking to make this time of year as far as a speculative ad. Do you think that? Do you- did you get any insight at all? I want to ask you about these running backs, but just like, as far as, did you get any insight at all, or just what do you think about, as a longtime observer of the Patriots, about who's going to be calling these plays on offense now? I mean, like we had read earlier in the week that Belichick was mulling over the idea of Matt Patricia, and to me, that's just like, it seems crazy. I believe that. I think Joe Judge is back, and maybe I don't. Could he call plays? I mean, wasn't he a special teams guy before? I think he might have been a wide receivers coach for
For 1 year.
little
Yeah.
like what's the sort of the background there, and just your general thoughts on what could happen with the offensive play calling.
So right now, it kind of appears to be a little bit of a three-headed monster with Bill Belichick's working a lot on offense. You've got Joe Judge working with the quarterbacks. You've got Matt Patricia working with the offensive line. There's some other guys thrown in there too.
So
Nick Caley was a tight end.
Is Patricia the offensive line coach now?
Essentially, it's him and Billy Yates, former NFL player. They've got another offensive assistant. I think Tyler Hughes is kind of working with the offensive line as well. But it looks like Matt Patricia is basically running the show with the offensive line. So if this was a typical staff, you might see roles for Judge and Patricia as maybe Judge is like a passing game coordinator and Patricia is a run game coordinator. Which is strange because Patricia was a defensive guy. He only spent 2 years on the offensive side of the ball when he first came to New England in the mid 2000s. Joe Judge, as he mentioned, special teams coordinator, spent 1 year as a wide receivers coach. But both those guys do obviously have head coaching experience. So that lends itself to the fact that they were able to work with both sides of the field. But, as far as who's going to be calling plays, during practice, when they get into 11 on 11s, it does look like Matt Patricia is doing it. But I thought that Mike Lombardi, who obviously spent quite a lot of time with Bill Belichick, is a good friend of Bill Belichick, he made some interesting comments yesterday that he was basically saying, if Matt Patricia is the offensive line coach, how is he going to be calling plays? Like if his job is to be, coaching the offensive line on the sideline, he doesn't really care what goes on past the offensive line, past the defensive line. So unless
Yeah.
Billy Yates takes on a bigger role on the offensive line, or unless the roles really shift around before training camp, my guess would be Belichick calling plays because he did that in Cleveland for a few years. Possibly Joe Judge. Obviously, like I said, Matt Patricia is still possibly in the mix, but no one really knows. I think Belichick doesn't even really know right now. It's a pretty small circle of trust in New England. So I don't think anyone really outside of those three plus maybe some guys in the front office have any idea what's going on with the offensive play calling situation.
Well, that's great information. So that's the information side. What is your what do you think that means for this offense, though? Just as you look, what does that mean?
Well,
I mean, there's been stability for so long with the play call. I mean, it's got to be something that's probably a little bit worrisome for fans. What is this what does this mean?
I think it's worrisome for fans. I think it might also be a little bit concerning for players as well. The fact that they, have this special teams guy and defensive guy in charge of the offense right now. But one thing that was interesting that some players have mentioned that there's been some terminology changes in New England. Bill Belichick said that they've streamlined things on offense, and that was very notable to me because, as we all know, for years and years and years, it was Josh McDaniels and Tom Brady, Julian Edelman, Rob Gronkowski. You've got Nick Caserio up in the coach's booth relaying information. 5 or 6 guys at that core who knew the offense front and back, had been in the system for 10 years, knew everything about it. And that was the strength of the Patriots offense. That, if those 6 or 7 guys knew what was going on, everyone else would kind of fall in line and figure it out. Now that basically all of those guys have left, Caceres with the Texans, Brady's in Tampa Bay, Julian Edelman's retired, Gronkowski's out of there, Josh McDaniels is with the Raiders. They were essentially forced to do this because that strength is gone. Everyone who used to know that system so well is gone, other than maybe, James White, David Andrews, some of these kind of holdovers a little bit. So I do think that they've streamlined some things. One thing that I thought was very interesting during camp is that when you see the running game, you're not really seeing guards pulling anymore. You're not seeing a fullback out there on the field. So maybe Belichick saw what, Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan have done. Maybe he goes to a little bit more of a zone running scheme because they were doing both for a number of years when Dante Scarnecchia was there. And like I said, everyone knew what was going on. Now I think they do have to streamline things and simplify things a little bit more. One other interesting thing, Bill O'Brien was around earlier in the spring. Maybe he could bring in some elements of the Alabama offense with some help from Mac Jones. You also saw Jed Fish around earlier this spring. He's the Arizona head coach, but he also spent some time with Sean McVay with the LA Rams. So I do think that there's other voices involved here, but I think that it could look pretty significantly different from what you used to see in the Tom Brady offense this year with the Patriots.
Is Mac Jones looking sharp? I mean, does he look like he's a guy that's ready to take the next step? Because we've heard all this stuff with the second-year quarterback, Zach Wilson. Mainly, we've seen the photos of how big he's gotten. But you've heard, I haven't seen photos of Mac Jones from up there at OTAs, but I did read some articles saying that he looks like he's kind of put on some good weight or maybe lost some baby fat or so. Does he look? What about Mac Jones?
The chin is definitely a little bit sharper this year, I'd say, on Mac Jones. I think the gut might be a little bit gone. He looks like he's transformed things a little bit this offseason, which I think was something the Patriots really wanted. And that's what you kind of expect to see out of these quarterbacks entering year 2. And I was really impressed with Mac Jones. He really didn't have many incompletions. I know it's mostly on air, 7-on-7s, 11-on-11s.
You'd expect Mac Jones to look good in that kind of setting, right? That's
right.
The kind of, yeah.
But I mean, like I said earlier, his touch passes were on point. He was hitting guys downfield really, really strongly. Not only Trey Nixon, you saw Nelson Aguilar making downfield catches, Jonnu Smith. I'd say they looked better on the deep throws than they did on the 10-yard outs. I coming out of I know it's kind of a flippant comment or whatever. It was kind of a comment off to the side, but at one point when he's hitting all of these deep throws, when he's completing all of these passes, I turned to another beat writer. I was like, is Mac Jones gonna be Joe Burrow this year? Are we gonna see that?
I love it. Sign me up. Yes.
And it's obviously way too early for all of that and everything. But Mac Jones was good last year, and if he can take another step forward, the tricky thing is that he doesn't have Josh McDaniels. He doesn't have an experienced play caller. He doesn't have Kyle Shanahan. He doesn't have Sean McVay. So he's going to have to work through that a little bit, the inexperience on the offensive play calling. It's also not the most talented Patriots, offensive roster, but he's got some playmakers around him. I think that he's a really smart quarterback, and if he can take that jump, then I think there could be big things for Mac Jones this year. I was impressed with him personally.
Did Cole Strange come right in and join the starting offensive line group?
Yeah, he was at left guard. One thing that was interesting is that since he was drafted in 2018, Isaiah Wynn has always been a left tackle with the Patriots. This year during minicamp and OTAs, We saw Trent Brown at left tackle, and we saw Isaiah Wynn at right tackle. Not totally sure what's going on there, but Trent Brown was the Patriots starting left tackle actually in 2018 when Isaiah Wynn was injured. Then Trent Brown played right tackle last year with Wynn at left tackle, but the line was Trent Brown at left tackle, Cole Strange at left guard, David Andrews at center, Michael Onwenu at right guard, and then Isaiah Wynn at right tackle. One kind of theory that we had about this is maybe they wanted to shift the weight around a little bit because Trent Brown and Michael Onwenu are two of the biggest offensive linemen in the NFL. And Cole Strange and Isaiah Wynn are, around the 300-pound range. So maybe they just wanted to kind of shift things around a little bit, especially if they're going to be doing some zone rushing stuff, not put all the weight there on the right side with Onwenu and Trent Brown. But definitely notable that those guys have shifted around.
Onwenu, I remember when he was like a 5th-round pick for those, 5th-round pick or something.
6th round out of Michigan.
Yeah,
yep.
I remember like he's like a 355-pounder, or at least he was when he
massive.
Came out. Yeah, yeah, and not super tall either. So it's an interesting theory there about the kind of balancing out the offensive line. I kind of like that.
For sure.
So the offensive, I mean, to me, you said it was Trent Brown, Strange, Andrews, Onwenu, and then Isaiah Wynn. On paper, that sounds pretty. That sounds like a pretty good offensive line.
For sure.
If you have you have a meathead caveman like Matt Patricia who's in charge of the run game, maybe they could get something going. Like what do you think? Like as far as these runners, because geez, they're James White's coming back, but they obviously had Damien Harris. What did you think about Radre Stevenson last year? He's a polarizing guy in the fantasy community, because people kind of can't wrap their heads around what he is, because he's built like an H-back or something, but he can catch the football. He's pretty slow, but it's like he has this skill set that not a lot of people really have, big, oversized, powerful runner who can catch the football, but slow, not very elusive. It's an interesting sort of combo with a guy like Damien Harris, who just got all the touchdowns, last season. Now they've drafted Pierre Strong. They drafted South Carolina,
Kevin
Harris.
Yep.
James White's still on the roster. I don't even know if like JJ Taylor or these guys are still even on the roster.
He's still there. Yep.
There's a lot of these dudes. How do you see it shaking out? Is this going to be just an ultimate committee? Is Damien Harris still looking like he's going to lead this thing? Is Ramondre Stevenson poised to break out a little bit? And then James White, I mean, he's starting to get a little bit old. I think he was drafted in 2013 or 2014.
Yep, 14,
Do you think that he's still in the – I mean, we forget he's pretty good. And like you mentioned earlier, he's a guy that's been around for all this different stuff during a season when things could be in flux. Like, how is this all going to play out? What does all this mean?
It's an interesting situation. I think that Ramondre Stevenson, just to start off with, since that's the guy you kind of mentioned there first, he's got a really weird skill set where he's like 6 feet 240, but he catches the ball and he's actually got some pretty quick feet. He's like a pretty strong runner, but like elusiveness is also one of his strengths, which is kind of weird just because he's so big. But he said something interesting where someone asked him what he wanted to improve on this offseason. He said that he was working on his routes and on being a third down back. So I don't know if he's going to be a traditional third down back for the Patriots, but I think that his goal is to be able to be on the field on third down. And if that's the case, if he really impresses this spring and summer and everything like that, I think that there's a possibility that James White could be left off this roster in September. I'm not saying it's a strong possibility or anything like that, but he signed a contract with the Patriots this offseason that did not have strong guarantees. It was not an overly strong contract. Then you go out there and you see them, drafting Pierre Strong. You see them drafting Kevin Harris. They've already got JJ Taylor on the roster. So there's only so many bodies that they can fit in that backfield. They don't have a fullback anymore. I do think this offense is going to change a little bit. I'm not sure if that third down back, that James White, Shane Vereen, Kevin Falk guy is going to be, overly necessary in this version of the offense. It might look that different. So I think that Damien Harris is probably still going to be the starting running back, but I do think that Ramondre Stevenson is going to get a lot of work in there. He had a good rookie season. Damien Harris was good last season. And then just as far as the rookies go, they're pretty different types of players.
Oh yeah.
Pierre Strong is the fastest running back the Patriots have had maybe ever. Certainly since
He's
Bill
fast.
Belichick came
Yeah.
in. Yeah, he's like a 4.3 guy.
Mhm.
But you look at him and you're like, he could probably get in the squat rack a little bit there over the offseason, strengthen those legs a little bit.
Skinny legs. He's good.
Little bit. And it's especially, I'd say you're comparing him to Damien Harris, who's got huge legs. You're comparing him to
tree trunk thighs. Yeah.
Right. Radre Stevenson, who's 240 or 250. And then Kevin Harris, also the rookie out of South Carolina. Like, he's another dude with like a really big, bottom half and everything like that. So maybe it's just, comparing Pierre Strong against those guys, but he did look a little bit smaller. But they were working those guys on pass catching drills. I think that, most likely you'll probably see redshirt seasons out of Pierre Strong and Kevin Harris. You'll probably see most of the work go to Damien Harris and Radre Stevenson. But yeah, I mean, I wish I could give you a little bit more intel, but I do think it's going to be the Harris and Stevenson show. And then we'll just kind of see who that third guy who comes in occasionally will be.
Well, we've seen you before. I guess I've never seen you at Patriots camp, but I know Byron's been up there and talked to you at Patriots camp, and he's come back and said on the show, he's like, man, well, I was talking to Kyed, and he was saying that it's like this runner's probably gonna be a healthy scratch this season.
Right.
Do you think that we might see that out of the guys like Pierre Strong and Kevin Harris and stuff, to where they could be game day inactives unless they really, really sort of step up and prove something during camp? Is that kind of how you see the pecking order sort of starting to shape up? Like, because if we're just doing projections like we're having to do for fantasy, it's like if you're gonna be putting the touch shares and you're gonna be counting in Pierre Strong and you're gonna be counting in Kevin Harris and stuff, all of a sudden things get really thin really quick for these other guys.
Yeah, no, I would say that things have shifted a little bit over the last few years, where in the past the Patriots basically redshirted all of their rookie running backs. But then you saw Sony Michel being like a 900-yard guy as a rookie. Rhamondre Stevenson last year had over 600 yards rushing, over 100 yards receiving. So they've actually started to play those rookies a little bit more. But this year, I see the depth there. It's tough to find a way where you've got Damien Harris, Rhamondre Stevenson, and maybe James White in front of Pierre Strong and Kevin Harris. I just have a hard time seeing them getting on the field. So unless there's an injury, unless James White doesn't make the team and Pierre Strong shines during preseason, whatever it is, I just think that they're probably not going to get a lot of work in their rookie seasons.
Very good. All right, there we have it from Doug Kyed about the breakdown from Patriots OTAs. Is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you just did you need to get out there? All right.
No, I don't think so. Yeah.
What about so you're a big national NFL reporter now, so I got to just hear what you're hearing or what you're thinking. I know that you're covering all the national stories closely. I know that this isn't anything that anybody has really any insight into because it's ongoing criminal investigations, or at least ongoing civil investigations and things like that. But just with Deshaun Watson, do you have any idea or any just what is your view on this? Like, now that there's been this New York Times article, there's been these two new accusers. Were we getting out over our skis a little bit when we had just kind of thought that Deshaun Watson's going to be back and playing for the Browns next year? Like, what do you think is going to happen? If you're just having to make a guess right now,
it's so hard to say. I always thought there was probably going to be like a 4 to 6 game suspension, something like that. The more that's come out, I don't know. Like, I think that they have to suspend him. I don't think that he'll be out there for a full season unless there's a long appeal, whatever it is. I think that they do need to suspend him for some amount of time. I've never really seen the possibility that could be, a full year suspension, or, with the MLB, they did a 2-year suspension. I don't see something like that coming down. I'm not sure what the public expectation is, but I think that that's maybe part of this. The NFL doesn't want to look like they're coming down too soft on these accusations. But I think that, 4 to 8 games, something like that seems like it's probably the most reasonable. Maybe the NFL shocks me and it's longer than that. But, just kind of seeing what other situations have been, they usually don't do those super lengthy suspensions. Yeah. But if more information comes out, or the more the information does come out, it's certainly possible that the Browns have made a gigantic error here in signing him to that massive guaranteed contract. Maybe he does, get a really lengthy suspension, but it doesn't really seem to be what the NFL usually does.
Yeah, you're not a contract specialist, and I didn't prepare you for this question. So if you don't know,
Oh,
it's
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 okay.
it's fine. But like, is there no way that they can kind of, if this goes to, like, they just have to pay him no matter, like, they just have to pay him? Like, is there no way that I wonder if there's any outs at all. It's probably have to ask a contract guy. That's just
Yeah, it is. I mean, usually there are, outs in contracts. And if I think that if there was like a legal situation beyond what they were aware of, then maybe there would be an easy way to get out of this or something like that. But I mean, I think Mike Flory of Pro Football talked throughout the possibility that maybe they could put him on the commissioner's exempt list this season while they figure this all out. And that would be, possibly even worse for the Browns, because then they'd still have to pay him while he's not playing. I know it's only like a $1 million salary this season. So I know that's not a huge concern for them, but I think pretty much anything is still on the table at this point.
I wonder if Baker Mayfield would ever play for those guys again. that'd be interesting, huh? Baker Mayfield 1 year revenge tour with the team that spurned him, and
I can't see it.
I don't think it would. I don't think it would happen.
I know.
You had the
show.
You had the piece. Speaking of Baker Mayfield, the teams that have been, I guess looking at them last year, the Browns didn't finish bottom of their division, but you wrote this article that I read some of it, but I said, I'm gonna stop reading this because I wanted to ask Doug about it on the pod. So it's about teams. You talked to some NFL executives and some of your sources about, what was it about teams that could go from worst to first.
Yeah, teams that could basically be this year's Bengals. Okay. Bengals they were last place in 2020, then they make a Super Bowl in 2021. And heading into the season, I think they had plus 15,000 odds or something like that to win a Super Bowl. So that was like, they were a super long shot, obviously, coming into last season.
So the teams who finished, last year, the Jets were last in the AFC East, the Ravens were last in the AFC North, which is surprising to me.
I know.
The Ravens were last, the Jags were last, the Broncos were last, the Giants were last, the Lions were last, the Panthers were last, and the Seahawks were last. Now, out of those guys, we could probably cross off from going to first. We could probably cross off Drew Lock or Geno Smith Seahawks, right? Yeah. Could probably cross off the Jaguars. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe not. What are these executives? Do you know what I think they said? I think they probably said, if you're looking at these teams, it's going to be the Ravens, or maybe it's going to be Denver, with what they've been able to do. Is that's kind of the vibe of what they said?
Yeah, pretty much. And some guys even kind of went off the board and said some teams have finished in third place. The Chargers were one pick, the Dolphins were another pick. But if I just look at the teams that, if I had to compare a situation to what the Bengals did last year, I think it would have to be either the Jaguars or the Jets. And of those two teams, I actually kind of think the Jaguars, I'm not saying the Jaguars are going to make the Super Bowl or anything like that, but no one in their right mind would have said last year that the Bengals were going to make the Super Bowl either. So I think that what it would take for the Jaguars this season to actually make a Super Bowl, Trevor Lawrence would have to play like Joe Burrow did last year. And based on what Trevor Lawrence did in college, based on, how esteemed he was coming out of college, not out of the realm of possibility. They've got Doug Peterson now, a lot more stability there at head coach. And I know that you could kind of critique the moves and the amount of money that they spent this offseason, but they brought in a lot of players in free agency that should make their roster a little bit better. I still think that the Jaguars are probably going to struggle a little bit this year. I think it's still kind of a rebuilding situation, but it's not as much of a rebuilding situation as maybe the Giants have, maybe the Seahawks have, some of these other teams that headed into the offseason knowing this was going to be a struggling year. AFC South is wide open. I think that the Jaguars are the most interesting team that you might be able to compare to the Bengals a year from now.
Well, I wish I had it pulled up. I wish I had their I wish I had the win totals just pulled up, but I think that the Jacksonville Jaguars only have like a 5.5 win total. If you were looking at that, is that something that you would find interesting? Like, if you think that they could, if they're the team that's most sort of like the the Bengals from last year, wouldn't that be a decent futures bet to make? Is maybe betting the over on these guys?
I like it. I know that on paper, betting on the Jaguars is always a little bit scary to do, but I think that they could be. I don't know. The AFC South it just seems so wide open to me, where no one really expects the Texans to do anything this year. The Colts, who knows what Matt Ryan looks like this season in a new uniform. Even the Titans, I mean, once you're willing to trade away AJ Brown, who knows how Ryan Tannehill looks this season? Like that just seems like a division that some team could creep up out of nowhere. And if there is a team this year, I think that it would be the Jaguars rather than a team like the Texans. But I don't know. Like I said, like you can critique the moves that they made. I don't think that they necessarily need to spend the amount of money they did on Zay Jones and on Christian Kirk, but at least they did add talent this season. So yeah, I actually kind of, I do. I kind of like that. I kind of like an over bet on the Jaguars win total.
I think that the sportsbook, DraftKings Sportsbook, must have read your article because they moved it from 5.5 to 6 even. So
there we go.
And I'm looking now too. It's also so AFC South. The Colts are minus 125 to win. The Titans are plus 170. Jacksonville's plus 700 to win. So you could get in on that right now. Houston Texans plus 3,000. I wouldn't recommend anybody bet on that.
It seems pretty fair, yeah.
All right, so he's Doug Kyed. Again, find him on Twitter at Doug Kyed. You can find all of his work over at pff.com. He tweets it all out from his Twitter. It's Kyed, Kyed. Doug, I always appreciate you coming on, brother. I just have one more question for you here. Oh, and also I have to plug Underdog Fantasy. Go to Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code ROSTER for a 100% deposit bonus up to $100. Get in the Best Ball Mania 3 tournament. Your chance to win $2 million up front, $1 million the second. It's a big time contest. Okay, Doug. Last question. Are the Rams teaching teams what they need to do about how they're going to build their rosters and stuff? I mean, we've just seen the big money to Aaron Donald. We've seen the big money to Cooper Kupp. These guys trade away all their picks. They spend all this money in free agency. How do they do this? Like I said, I know you're not a contract specialist, but just from a general stance, when you talk to your fellow colleagues, you talk to your reporters, and you just sort of think about these teams and these bills on a granular level. Like, is the Rams' way of doing things? Is this the new way of doing things? I mean, what are your thoughts on this? And how do they seem like they don't even care about a salary cap? They just don't even. It's like they don't even figure in.
Part of it is that with a lot of these contracts, they're extending guys. So they extended Cooper Kupp, they extended Aaron Donald. So by extending them, that actually lowers their cap hit for this season. So that's kind of a way that they are actually making all these deals and still signing guys like Allen Robinson and all these other players, is that by extending these guys, they actually do lower their salary cap. They're going to have to pay the bills at some point down the line. And maybe you see them get into kind of a New Orleans Saints situation where they have to just keep pushing it back and back and back. Yeah. But they're actually in pretty good shape salary cap wise this year and even into the future, because those guys are all now already locked up. They don't have to worry about all those contracts. Now at this point, the key is for them to draft really well in the middle rounds, because as you said, they keep trading away their draft picks. They can't have those. I don't know what's going to happen to them this year, but like they drafted Tutu Atwell last year in the second round. I'm not sure if that's going to wind up being the most valuable pick, but they have to keep hitting on those mid-round guys. I'm not sure if it's a sustainable way for other teams to do business in the future. Maybe there's some copycats and those don't go well. And teams kind of see that it only really worked if you draft really well, like the Rams did with guys like Cooper Kupp and Aaron Donald. But I don't know. It is fascinating. But the one thing that I would just keep pressing is that they're still functioning under the salary cap. It's just that by extending these guys and lowering their salaries, they are able to spread out those cap hits, and that's why they're able to stay under the cap as